Hello, I'm Mark Chris, Head of Adult Programming for the Central Arkansas Library System, and I'm also a Civil War historian, having written several books and edited several books on the Civil War in Arkansas. And today I'm going to talk about the 1863 campaign to capture Little Rock. So on July 4, 1863, two events occurred that had a direct influence on the ultimate fate of the capital city. In Vicksburg, Mississippi, the Confederate defenders of that beleaguered fortress surrendered to Union forces under General U.S. Grant, opening the Mississippi River to untrammeled Federal river traffic. On the same day, at Helena, Arkansas, Confederate forces under Lieutenant General Theophilus Holmes attacked the strongly entrenched Union troops there and suffered serious losses in their defeat there. This latter attack decimated Confederate forces in Arkansas, while the former event freed thousands of Union troops for use in other theaters. And a little more than 2 months after the fall of Vicksburg, Federal soldiers would occupy Little Rock. So the chain of events that resulted in the Little Rock campaign began with the capture of a rebel lieutenant in Missouri in early July of 1863. And this captured soldier executed one of the grand deceptions of the Trans-Mississippi Theater as he spun a tale of an impending invasion of Missouri by 19,000 troops under Major General Sterling Price. Brigadier General John Wynne Davidson, who we see here, was commanding troops in eastern Missouri, and he took the bait. He reported that, quote, Price crossed from Jacksonport to Crowley's Ridge by a good road 40 miles, and Davidson moved to intercept. Major General U.S. Grant, with his characteristic overview of the region's strategic situation, pledged to immediately send a division of troops now idle at Vicksburg to Helena to release that stronghold's garrison to pursue Price. But Grant bluntly told Major General Stephen Hurlbut in Memphis that I cannot believe any portion of your command is in any danger from anything more than a cavalry raid. And Grant, of course, was correct. Confederate offensive operations in Arkansas were virtually impossible following Helena. Theophilus Holmes's, who we see here, his disastrous July 4 attack on Helena cost the Confederates 1,636 casualties, or 20% of the rebel troops who were involved in that attack. The Southern infantry in particular was decimated. The whole army was demoralized, and desertion was rampant, especially among the Arkansas brigades of James Fagan and Dandridge McCrae, who had both suffered heavy casualties at Helena. Now, Davidson moved on to Crowley's Ridge in command of a cavalry division of 6,000 troopers. Now, Davidson was a regular Army, a West Pointer, a Virginian who remained loyal to the Union. And his regular Army discipline did not always go particularly well with his all-volunteer troops. One Missouri cavalryman wrote home that, quote, our men are very much put out with General Davidson, and some of them are trying to kill him, in which undertaking I hope they will be successful. It's worth noting, too, that as part of this 6,000-man cavalry division, there was a battalion of the 32nd Iowa Infantry that, under his command in southeast Missouri, had angered Davidson, and they were ordered to follow the rest of the troops. So this one battalion of infantry had the unenviable task of keeping up with a cavalry division of horsemen. Davidson crossed the St. Francis River at Chalk Bluff, which is literally the instep of the boot heel of Missouri, on July 9, driving a thin screen of rebel riders before him. By July 24, he was at Gainesville, near present-day Paragould, and Colonel John Q. Burbridge, a Confederate colonel, reported himself, quote, satisfied that this is no raid of the enemy, but it is their intention this time to march to Little Rock. And the federal strategy had indeed changed from the defense to the offense. Realizing the full extent of their victory at Helena, Union tacticians devised a two-pronged attack, with Davidson being joined by Union infantry from Helena. So as Davidson's horsemen spread across Crowley's Ridge, they were continuously harassed by rebel horsemen. First Lieutenant Franklin Spillman Denny of the 1st Missouri Cavalry, U.S., described a typical encounter during the drive down Crowley's Ridge, writing, "We was on the march at an early hour this morning. Nothing new transpired on the march except a few bushwhackers fired to our advance guard and then run into the thick brush. We came back to the command and went into camp." Trooper A.W.M. Petty, in his diary, wrote that weather very warm, blackberries very scarce, and Union folks quite as much so. On July 29, Davidson arrived at Witzburg on the St. Francis River, where his troops built this fortification that still exists today on Crowley's Ridge, and they received the first rations that they got in this campaign on steamboats from Helena. And 2 days later, Davidson learned that he was now under the command of this man, Major General Frederick Steele, a West Pointer fresh from the victory at Vicksburg. The rebels also received a new commander as Theophilus Holmes turned over command of the Confederate Army in Arkansas to Sterling Price on July 22. The new commander of Confederate troops in Arkansas, fearing that the movements on Crowley's Ridge presaged a move on Little Rock, began moving his forces into positions to where they would be able to defend the capital better. He also commenced construction of strong earthworks on the north side of the Arkansas River, about 2.5 miles east of Little Rock. Much of this is on today's Park Hill area in North Little Rock. But Price reported that while I should attempt to defend Little Rock as the capital of the state and the key to the important valley of the Arkansas, I did not believe it would be possible for me to hold with the forces then under my command. Well, Davidson turned west to Clarendon and began marching across the Grand Prairie. But he went to Clarendon on the White River, where he would await Steele's infantry. While there, he was joined by some gunboats under Captain G.M. Bach of the U.S. Navy, and this led to the only naval component of the Little Rock campaign. On August 12, Davidson sent the Cricket, Memora, and Lexington up the White River to find, quote, the ubiquitous Marmaduke and his cavalry. At the mouth of the Little Red, this vessel, the Cricket, is sent up after a pair of steamers, while the other two vessels go up the White to smash up some things in Augusta. The Cricket, meanwhile, found Marmaduke's pontoon bridge near Searcy and destroyed it, and seized two steamers, the Tom Sug and Kaskaskia, and then began heading triumphantly downstream toward the White. A part of Joe Shelby's Iron Brigade was angered at this audacity and tried to ambush the flotilla near West Point in White County. The Kaskaskia's pilot was wounded, and she swung uncontrolled downstream while the Iowa infantry and Missouri cavalry fired at each other. The Iowa commander noted that it was very warm work, the fire being at a distance of about 30 yards. And in that action, this man, Private George Fox of the 32nd Iowa Infantry, was mortally wounded. Well, the Cricket managed to take the Kaskaskia under tow and continued downstream, and they were joined by this vessel, the Lexington, when the Confederates again opened fire. Quote, the Cricket opened with her howitzers, the old Lexington with her 8-inch guns, which must have given them such a scare as never before, for they left very suddenly. And that ended the naval expedition. Steele, meanwhile, had gathered an attack force of 6,000 infantry and 16 artillery pieces to join Davidson's horsemen in assaulting the capital. These men included the Helena garrison troops who had fought off Holmes's July 4 attack and veterans idled after the capitulation of Vicksburg, gathered in Helena. And they were not fond of the Mississippi riverport called Gravetown and Helen, Arkansas, by the garrison troops. And one newcomer, in fact, wrote home that the town's name should be spelled with two L's. So Steele held a grand review of his infantry on the morning of August 10 and started westward that evening. Charles Musser of the 29th Iowa Infantry expressed the confidence of many of Steele's troops when he wrote that we will find no enemy on our march worthy of notice, only the myriads of gnats and mosquitoes, and that we are all in good spirits and are ready for the tramp. The Yankees, however, would soon discover that eastern Arkansas held foes far deadlier than gnats and mosquitoes or Confederates, as they faced the blistering heat of an Arkansas August and the debilitating malarial diseases that awaited them in the region's miasmic swamps. Captain Thomas Stevens of the 28th Wisconsin reported, "This has been a terrible day for us who go on foot. The dust, the hot sun, and sweltering heat, it was rough. The men fell out by scores. We were marched too far for men in our condition, and this time of year in Arkansas, half the time without water." A Minnesota soldier concurred, stating simply, "The heat and the dust added to the debilitated state of the system in this climate is quite as much as humanity can stand." After a week's march, most of the infantry had joined Davidson's cavalry in Clarendon, and the White River town was a poor choice for the exhausted and sick troops. A.F. Sperry of the 33rd Iowa summed it up, writing, "Clarendon was the very home and headquarters of ague in bulk and quantity. The very air was thick with it. We could almost hew out blocks of it and splash them in the river. Comparatively speaking, the real genuine Clarendon shake is the ordinary chills and fever, about as a big bulldog is to a pet poodle." By August 22nd, 1,000 of Steele's men were down. He wrote, "The sick list is frightful, including many officers. One brigade is commanded by a lieutenant colonel, two colonels having given up in the last 3 days. If you do not send reinforcements, I shall likely meet with disaster. This is the poorest command I have ever seen except the cavalry." On the 23rd, he sent his horsemen toward Little Rock while the infantry headed upriver to higher ground at Duval's Bluff. The sick there were callously treated. Captain Thomas Stevens of the 28th Wisconsin wrote that several men had died on the boats during the day and night, and not a coffin was to be had, hardly a board. We have 700 or 800 sick men here and very inadequate provision for their comfort. It seems hard to see so much misery which we can't relieve. But Duval's Bluff, which is pictured here, would become a major Union town. It's very well located on the White River, which is the most navigable river in Civil War Arkansas. It's also the terminus of the only railroad that then existed in Arkansas. The Memphis and Little Rock Railroad stretched between Duval's Bluff and what is today North Little Rock, and would be an important means of supplying the capital after its capture. So after establishing a strong base and supply line at Duval's Bluff, Steele was ready to head toward Little Rock, crossing the vast dry prairies east of the city. Captain J.F. Youngs of the 5th Kansas Cavalry, noting that "I'm having the biggest kind of ague, but I'm doing duty and feeling cross and ugly." Youngs wrote that this section of Arkansas compares but poorly with that of the Mississippi Valley. There you find the wealthy cotton planter, here the poor clay eater. Between the White and Arkansas rivers you will find prairies beautiful to look upon, but useless for agriculture, the soil being cold, wet, and boggy. Game is plenty, and the natives, being from the hilly portions of Tennessee and Kentucky, have lived chiefly by the rifle and knife, which such do I find life in the interior of Arkansas. And a soldier of the 50th Indiana Infantry also had little good to say about the Grand Prairie, writing home that "This country is as famous for the fever and ague as the White River ever was, and rattlesnakes, lizards, ticks, and chiggers are beyond calculation, so that rest is the next thing to impossible." In addition to the resident Burman, the advancing Union troops would be met primarily by tough Confederate cavalry, the few rebel infantrymen being concentrated in the extensive earthworks under construction on the north side of the Arkansas River across from Little Rock. Sterling Price apparently thought Steele would obligingly smash his troops against strong fortifications, as Price had done at Helena. On August 25, the Union advance struck Marmaduke at Brownsville, a hamlet about 30 miles east of Little Rock. The Confederates fell back after an initial encounter, and the Federals pursued cautiously, pausing to shell tree lines in order to avoid potential ambush. Captain Albert Denuth of the 8th Missouri wrote that, "We shelled him for an hour probably, when our regiment prepared to fight on foot. We went into the brush and searched all around for him, but could not find him. He gave us the slip." The next day, a Union patrol and force scouted the military road between Brownsville and Bayou Mito, which is at modern-day Jacksonville. Spirited skirmishing began, but the Yankees turned back to their base after, quote, "One cannoneer was pierced through a solid shot and killed instantly. So well did the enemy have range of the road." On August 27, Davidson moved out in force against the persistent rebel horsemen. The rebels' first line of defense consisted of about 125 dismounted troopers of Shelby's Iron Brigade under Colonel Gordon, detailed to Marmaduke that morning to serve as skirmishers and accompanied by the Little Teaser Prairie guns of Charlie Bell's battery. These troops watched the approaching Yankees as, quote, "They pushed forward their columns impetuously until coming upon the main body of our skirmishers, a roar of musketry sent death crippling through their ranks, completely breaking up their lines for the time in dismay and confusion." Well, the dismay and confusion did not last long, as the advancing Yankees drove Marmaduke back to a fixed line of defenses above Bayou Mito, which Colonel Glover described as a very strong and elevated position, covered by extended rifle pits on the left, where he made a more obstinate stand. The Confederates were soon flanked from their works, hastened in part by a trick played by Davidson, who ordered drums beaten to convince the rebels that the Union cavalry had infantry support. The Rebs made a charge on our battery, and when this was done, a regiment of cavalry stood with pistols and carbines, a Missouri trooper recounted. When they charged near enough, these men with drums beat the charge, and the Rebs thought 10,000 infantry was on them, and they turned and run, our men firing volley after volley, and the artillery using grape and canister, piling them up in heaps. After this, the general sat on his horse and laughed to see them run at the trick he played on them. The Southerners retired to the south bank of Bayou Mito, and the tar-soaked bridge was set afire. Davidson ordered the 1st Iowa Cavalry to charge and seize the blazing span, and Confederate Colonel Gordon watched as, quote, "The Iowans, perhaps thinking the frightened rebels in terror fled, charged down the road in splendid style, as if to save the bridge, but it were better had many of them never been born. The dense cloud of smoke from the crackling, burning bridge, like sorrow's veil, hung between them and Bledsoe's battery, and when the head of their long lines had nearly reached the bridge, these noble old guns sent shell and shot, winged with fury, screaming and hissing up their lines, scattering the mangled fragments of men and horses like chaff before the wind." Now, that's how you write a report. Most of the day's Union casualties occurred during that determined, if hopeless, charge. After the charge of the 1st Iowa, most of the fighting at Bayou Mito consisted of a artillery duel between Union and Confederate cannon. A Union round killed Lieutenant Charlie Bell and seriously wounded one of Marmaduke's aides, and the angry Marmaduke ordered all of his 6 guns massed to punish the Federal cannoneers. Lieutenant R.E. Collins had previously snuck across the bayou and reconnoitered the Yankee position, which allowed them to pour their fire into the hapless Union cannoneers. As the disconcerted Yankee artillerymen took accurate fire from the rebel batteries, Colonel John Newman Edwards of Shelby's command tells us, "They entirely lost their coolness and precision and sent their shells recklessly through the tops of the trees, destroying much foliage and frightening the wild birds terribly." Davidson's troops did have one opportunity to turn the Confederate right by a way of this shallow ford that we see here today, which was held only by 100 men of Young's battalion of Marmaduke's brigade. But a half-hearted and unsupported attack by 2 squadrons of the 1st Iowa Cavalry failed to press the issue, and the Confederates held the battlefield. By late evening, Davidson's troopers were ordered to fall back to Brownsville as, quote, the sun went down, smoke began, red-faced and furious. Union losses were 7 killed and 38 wounded, mostly of the 1st Iowa from that charge. Confederate losses were undisclosed, but included at least 2 officers killed and several soldiers wounded. Though the Federal advance was halted, rebel forces were ordered to fall back within 5 miles of Little Rock that night, abandoning the substantial lines of defenses east of the capital. And as the 2 armies fell to skirmishing for several days, perhaps the most bizarre occurrence of the Little Rock campaign transpired. On September 6, Confederate Cavalry Commander Lucius M. Walker on the right and John Sappington Marmaduke on the left culminated their long simmering duel with their long simmering feud with a duel. So at the Battle of Helena, Marmaduke had attacked one of the Union batteries, and Walker was supposed to support him on his left and failed to do so. In the recent fighting at Brownsville, the plan had been for Marmaduke to draw the Federal cavalry into an ambush by Walker's men, and Walker failed to be in position for that. Finally, at Reed's Bridge in Jacksonville, at Bayou Mito, Marmaduke repeatedly asked Walker to join him on the firing line, and he failed to do so again. So after the fight in Jacksonville, Marmaduke asked to either be removed from under Walker's command or that his resignation from Confederate forces be accepted. Sterling Price approved the transfer instead of losing Marmaduke. On hearing that his actions had been censured, Walker at first only laughed, but that laughter turned to anger when he heard that his courage was called into question. The 2 generals began exchanging notes, which gradually accelerated. Most of those just passing between their staff officers, and it was actually a staff officer who decided that Marmaduke had insulted Walker's honor to the point that they would offer a formal challenge to a duel. Around midnight on September 5, Price learned of the impending duel and sent orders to both of the generals to remain closely at his headquarters for the next 24 hours. Walker never received the order, and Marmaduke ignored it. So they met at the Lefevre plantation about 7 miles below Little Rock on the north side of the Arkansas River. Arriving before dawn, and their seconds selected the location for the ritual combat, pacing the distance and ensuring that neither general would have the advantage of the rising sun at his back. Each of them held a 6-shot regulation model 1851 Navy 1 Colt revolver. At the command to fire, both loosed a single shot with no effect. Marmaduke immediately fired again, striking Walker in the side. As the Tennessean fell backward, his pistol fired harmlessly, and he was in fact mortally wounded. Using Marmaduke's wagon, they transported Walker to the Cates residence in Little Rock, where the general lingered until the next evening. And as he lay dying, Walker asked an aide to, quote, to see General Marmaduke and tell him that before taking the sacrament, I forgive him with all my heart, and I want my friends to forgive him and neither prosecute nor persecute him. He was buried in Little Rock's Mount Holly Cemetery with full military honors on September 8th. Now, this news was received with glee by the Union troops, and it did nothing for Confederate morale. So while this drama was playing out, Steele had determined his strategy for the final attack on Little Rock. Chasing the rebels from their camp at Ashley's Mills, he decided to cross the Arkansas at a bend in the river where his massed artillery could pour converging fire on any Southern opposition. Archibald Dobbs, who we see here, the successor to the late General Walker, had the unenviable job of holding the south bank of the river along a 12-mile stretch with a dozen fords. So the Union cavalry, as it had throughout the campaign, would bear the brunt of the offensive on September 10. Davidson told his cavalry commanders on the night before that, quote, No ordinary obstacle was to be allowed to defeat the purpose of the division, that we were to make a dash upon the city and capture it, and either hold or destroy the enemy's bridges, though it cost us one of our regiments. Union pioneers labored through the night of September 9, building a pontoon bridge across the Arkansas. At daylight, C.B. Etter's Confederate battery opened fire, quote, and his second shot took effect, clearing the bridge of workmen. However, quote, before the smoke of the first discharge of their guns had scarcely reached the tops of the trees which concealed their movements, 20 guns belched forth from concealment on the north side of the river, a stream of shells into their midst of their battery. Davidson's artillery chief, Captain Julius Hadley, made that report. The 11th Ohio Battery alone fired 100 rounds in this engagement, and the south bank was soon cleared of Confederates. And at 10 a.m., the Yankees began to cross the river. Willie Hale of the 3rd Minnesota watched this happen. He wrote, "The 40th Iowa advanced a half mile to the wood most gallantly in perfect silence, withholding our breath, expecting to see a sheet of flame leap out of the woods that would send many a brave fellow to his long home. Oh, 'twas thrilling, but nary a Reb was there. They were outwitted." So as Davidson's cavalry crossed the river, Steele began moving his infantry toward Price's earthworks on the north side of the river. Steele had 10,477 men present for duty and 57 cannon. Price had 7,749 men of all arms. Only about 1,250 of them would face Davidson, while the remaining 65 or 100 or so manned the trenches on the north side of the river. Most of the fighting took place along Bayou Fourche, a meandering stream south of the Arkansas, and the terrain there soon created essentially two battles. Union cavalry under Colonel J.M. Glover moved forward through the heavy woods on the right. They soon encountered rebel troops under Colonel J.M. Jeffers, and a sharp fight broke out. The Missouri Artillery Battery under Gustav Stang was ordered to fire on the Southerners, but, quote, instead of obeying orders, he fell back and even failed to fire from where he was, which was an excellent range for grape and canister. Lieutenant James Stewart of the 10th Illinois Cavalry ordered the Missouri Germans to run the guns out by hand, but they all got under the gun carriages and did not obey. This left Lovejoy's battery unsupported, and jubilant rebel horsemen rushed the artillerymen, capturing the battery. Lieutenant Lovejoy succeeded in escaping with a severe wound from a minie ball in his leg, Union Artillery Chief Hadley reported. These guns could only have been saved by a sacrifice of life of far more value than the guns or the moral effect of their recapture, as they were in the power of a concealed force of the enemy, at least 500 strong, covered by a naturally strong position. Well, the loss of Lovejoy's battery led Glover to change his tactics as he faced the Confederate troops massed between Bayou Fourche and the Arkansas River. "I now determined to fight him in his own way, and brought up the 10th Illinois and 3rd Missouri and dismounted them to fight on foot in 3 lines, with skirmishers fronting his line of battle and a second line following in a solid row between the bayou and the river. In this manner, the Yankee troops steadily forced Jeffers' Confederates back toward Little Rock." On the left, meanwhile, Colonel Lewis Merrill advanced through a cornfield toward Colonel Robert C. Newton's Confederates entrenched behind the Bayou Fourche levee. And this was at about the location of modern Bayou Fourche Road. It's worth noting that Colonel Lewis Merrill might be the only general involved in this campaign who had his own music. Anyways, Pratt opened with his 2 guns and quickly drove them back, Newton reported. Moving to our right, they attempted to force a crossing of the bayou, but were met and handsomely driven back by Bull's command, assisted by Pratt's trusty guns, which continued to rake them with canister and grape until Fletcher's field, which was immediately in my front, was cleared of them. Captain Albert DeMuth and the 8th Missouri Cavalry was on the receiving end of that fire. DeMuth wrote, "We dismounted and proceeded about a quarter of a mile when the grape and canister came rattling among us like hail. One man belonging to Company L was shot in the stomach right in front of me. When we got into the cornfield, here they gave us Hail Columbia, For a short time, we squatted down in the weeds and grass as close to Mother Earth as possible, but nevertheless the enemy's shells bursted immediately over us, wounding several of our men. As the cavalrymen advanced on the south side of the Arkansas, Steele's infantry and artillery moved along with them on the north side of the river. The Union cannon helped break up resistance to Glover's horsemen firing from the north bank. An Illinois captain reported, "The last 2 miles we moved with great rapidity, and I have reason to believe rendered good service to General Davidson's division, completely breaking up the enemy's line of battle twice, producing disorder and the tallest kind of skedaddling." So Sterling Price, with the memory of the Confederate Army at Vicksburg fresh in his mind, also decided it was time to skedaddle. Even as the rebel horsemen desperately fought Davidson's cavalry at Fouche Bayou, he was pulling the Confederate defenders from their extensive works on the north side of the river, fearing they would be cut off and captured if they did not make it across the flimsy pontoon bridge to get into Little Rock. He also ordered railroad cars and supplies burned, and the ironclad vessel, the CSS Pontchartrain, destroyed. A Missouri artilleryman reported, "We cross in good order. We have planted one section of our battery on the bluff in the city to cover the crossing of the remaining troops and wagons. While we sit on the bluff, we can see the burning flames to the boats and cars. 8 or 10 boats burned to ashes. We commenced retreating about 5 o'clock. Another Missourian reported that by the time we reached the river, we were almost suffocated with heat. The air was filled with smoke from the burning boats and cars and other property. This seemed to indicate a retreat." And as the rebels retreated southward through the city, Union horsemen raced toward Little Rock. Trooper James Rogers of the 3rd Iowa Cavalry reported, "The 3rd Iowa, with Colonel Caldwell at the head, were the first to charge into the city. And as they passed town, they were met by women old and young, waving their handkerchiefs and clapping their hands. Company M rushed forward to the Capitol and hoisted their guidon on top of the steeple. Companies F and G proceeded to the arsenal and hoisted their guidons there, while the other 3 companies busied themselves running out 2 or 3 regiments of rebels that were trying to blow up the arsenal and fire the town. The 27th Arkansas Infantry served in the southern rear guard, and they weren't happy with Price's order to retreat. Silas Turnbow of that regiment wrote, "It did not take us long to find that we were giving up Little Rock to the enemy, and that our entire army was on the retreat, and our regiment was acting as rear guard while we were evacuating the town. It was our last hope for Arkansas, and it would soon be in the hands of the Federals." So by 5 p.m., the last Confederates were out of town, and by 7 p.m., civil authorities formally surrendered the city. Davidson reported proudly that the United States arsenal, uninjured, with what stores remained in it, was repossessed. And it's worth mentioning here that General Davidson and his men had bonded over the course of this campaign, and where they had been hoping to assassinate him when the campaign began. At the conclusion of the Little Rock campaign, his men presented him with a presentation sword. So I'm not a fan of Sterling Price, and his strategy in this campaign amounted to little more than waiting for Steele to smash himself against Price's earthworks. But he made a good call in abandoning the capital, and probably would have lost all of his infantry in North Little Rock if he had not abandoned Little Rock. So the next day, Colonel Lewis Merrill led a pursuit of the pursuing retreating rebels. The next day, he returned to the capital after doing little more than harrying the Confederate rear guard in a pursuit that Steele later characterized as not as vigorous as it should have been. And the Little Rock campaign was over. So the aftermath. For the Union, their health improved exponentially. Madison Bowler of the 3rd Minnesota wrote, "The health of the troops is improving since we arrived here, where we can get good water and high ground to camp upon. During the march, we got very poor water to drink. Most of the time, nothing but bayou water." They also captured a lot of materiel. At the arsenal, they seized 3,000 pounds of gunpowder and a considerable quantity of cartridges. Several siege guns that had been salvaged from Arkansas Post in January were captured. Two locomotives, parts of the pontoon bridge survived. Indeed, as one rebel remembered, most of the ordnance, quartermaster, and commissary stores housed in the capital were left for the enemy. And politically, it met one of Abraham Lincoln's war aims by placing another Confederate capital under Union control, and that opened the way for the election of a Unionist governor a few months later. Perhaps most importantly, the capture of Little Rock, which came 9 days after Union troops regained control of Fort Smith, placed the entire Arkansas River Valley under the tenuous Union control, and this effectively split the Trans-Mississippi Confederacy in half for the remainder of the war. For the Confederates, it was not so good. They were banished to southwest Arkansas, an area with limited supplies for the army. Theophilus Holmes observed that we were an army of prisoners and self-supporting at that. And morale plummeted, and desertion skyrocketed, especially among the Arkansas troops. Silas Turnbow of the 27th Arkansas wrote, "They did not sneak off to keep anyone from seeing them go. They left publicly in squads of 4 or 5. They were neither ashamed nor afraid. It looked like for a while they would all go, but enough men remained to keep the company officers a few men to command. I well recollect some of the officers in command of their companies, when the few men would straggle, would give the command, 'Boys, all 3 of you close up in ranks,' or 'all 4 of you keep near together,' or 'all 5 of you must not separate,' as the case may be." Confederate General Harris Flanagan reported desertions were so high that a pitched battle would have been less costly. But the effect of the loss of the capital on Arkansas's Confederates was perhaps best expressed by W. W. Garner of Quitman, Arkansas, a young Confederate officer. Garner wrote, "In bygone days, I thought I felt the sting of being deprived of my family, but I acknowledge that I never, until the fall of Little Rock, felt the sting of being in exile." So that's the Little Rock campaign. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email at mchrist@cals.org. And thank you.